Ramin Bahrani. I'm a filmmaker and a professor here at the School of the Arts here at Columbia, teaching film directing. It's the third of these events. It's a series I created called The Bigger Picture. I confess partially because I want to meet really exciting people, and I also wanted my students to get engaged with things other than just film, but how film can intersect with so many different parts of our world. Tonight we're going to show Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee's film, 1989, premiered in Cannes, was released, if you can believe this, by Universal Pictures. I was startled to realize that when I saw it again. I cannot imagine that happening today. I was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, including Best Screenplay for Spike Lee. It's often cited in the top 100 greatest films of all time. It's been deemed, quote, culturally significant by the Library of Congress. I saw the film, I hadn't seen the film in over a decade, and watching it again in the last couple of weeks a few times over, it was just very startling. It was as if the film was made in response to what's been happening in the last couple of years. As a filmmaker, I found myself energized as a human being. I was somehow very frightened by what I was seeing and very sad by how the situation has changed somewhat, but not really. I also want to note there's 2 great actors in this film. There's a lot of great actors, but 2 I want to talk about, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee. They play the mayor and mother-sister. If you don't know, you probably do. They were really pioneers in the film industry for African Americans, also socially and politically very active. They got into the NAACP Image Awards Hall of Fame, the National Medal of Arts, and the Kennedy Center honors. They were also very close friends of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And I want to circle back to Dr. King and Malcolm X at the end of the screening, because we're going to have a great conversation with 4 amazing panelists that are going to be joining us. So please stay. We'll just as soon as the film ends, we're going to start the panel, and that'll be kind of a great way to talk. And then there'll also be Q&A. So probably the film's going to create a lot of questions and reactions. So we'll have a lot of chance to talk to the panelists. Okay, thanks. Hello. Okay, so I'm sure you're feeling what I felt watching the film again. It's just really makes your blood boil in a way. Let's introduce the panel. I would like to start with my, I'm honored to say my colleague here at Columbia, Patricia Williams, who is the James L. Dorr Professor of Law here at Columbia University. She authors a monthly column, The Diary of a Mad Law Professor, for The Nation magazine. She's the author of the seminal book, The Alchemy of Race and Riots, as well as many other books, and has been the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. Patricia Williams. I'd like to introduce a gentleman I've just had the pleasure of meeting tonight, Noche Diaz. He's a New York-based revolutionary, a member of the New York City Revolution Club, where he has spoken out against stop and frisk, mass incarceration, police brutality. In the past 4 years, he's been targeted and harassed by the NYPD repeatedly. I think probably arrested maybe over 10 times in the last 4 years. He'll give us a different perspective. Noche Diaz. Marylin Zuniga is an educator and organizer based in Newark, New Jersey. She's graduated Teachers College here at Columbia, has a master's in curriculum and teaching. She is a member of the Maroon Project and Books and Breakfast program in Newark. Most recently, she was fired from the Orange Board of Education in New Jersey for allowing her students to write to the political prisoner Mumia Abu Jamal. You may have heard this story, and we're very happy to welcome Marylin. And Jamilah Lemieux is a senior editor at Ebony magazine. In addition, she's an award-winning writer and speaker, a leading millennium voice in issues around race, gender, and sexuality. She is self-described pesky black feminist who challenges the status quo while remaining fresh and fabulous at all times. Please welcome. This film was in many ways, according to Spike Lee, was inspired in many ways by the Howard Beach killing. This was back in 1986. 23-year-old Michael Griffith, who lived in Bed-Stuy, his car broke down, was chased by a angry white mob, him and his friends, and then he was struck by a car and killed. And this was after a series of other white mobs attacking African Americans in that time. I would like to start with Patricia because you wrote about Howard Beach. You wrote that a story of how boundaries are drawn, how little sub-nation states get drawn in the name of neighborhood values, and also the tension between property values and human rights. You also said that the continuing struggle for racial justice is tied up with the degree to which segregation and the outright denial of black humanity have been naturalized in our civilization. Here we are almost 30 years after Howard Beach, and almost as far away since Do the Right Thing. Seeing the film again, what were you thinking? Has anything changed?
Well, certainly things have changed. For the better, I'm not certain. And it was striking to me to see this film after so many years. And it struck me as being a tension between both the very, very tough times New York was in that time, because it wasn't just about police-citizen confrontations. It was also about the fiscal crisis, the wake of there were wars going on in New York City that to some extent have become more invisible. At the same time, it feels almost a little bit innocent as the film, because I think police forces have become so much more weaponized, and it was shocking to see the chokehold being applied at a time when people were still discussing whether or not that ought to be used or not, and now it's been 20 years at least that it's been outlawed, and it's still being used. So there is something that is very disheartening about the persistence of these images as repeated, but repeated against a backdrop that I think has become really troublesomely hardened. Fox News wasn't in the backdrop to the same degree that it is now. I mean, I was really struck by the fact that the media in this film is a local media outlet, and so many of those have disappeared, or those voices, those local voices, aren't mediating in the same way, and now it's either Fox News or whatever else there is, or online. And it's our communities are not, there were boundaries of communities, but there was also a sense of community. And I also think that the degree to which we have become so much a carceral state, in terms of local prisons, jails, and federal policy, that has so transformed this, and the militarization of our police, the images feel almost innocent, as awful as this movie is, and as much as it reiterates what we're experiencing now. I think on balance, I feel like we're potentially in a more rigidly confined public space now, and that's distressing. I'd love to, please tell me I'm wrong. But
well, I'm curious to hear from everyone, but in this case, I would love to start with Noche, because you're coming face to face with the police. I dare say face to fist, maybe, in terms of getting harassed, and Spike talks about the idea in this film of how when the police show up for the riot, that they're in riot gear in order to incite the riot. And I think this seems, Patricia, to only have escalated to, as you saying, the militarization of the police. What are you encountering, and what are what's happening on the ground for you right now, and how do you see this?
Well, interesting comment about the cops starting a riot in riot gear. In Baltimore, I was, on the streets with the youth, and the rebellion that sparked off, it was because the police came and in riot gear sent out riot squads to shut down a transport hub and mall where all these youth tried to get buses to go home, and that was totally shut down. All these youth had nowhere to go and were gathering on the streets facing down a bunch of cops in riot gear and with armored vehicles and militarized weapons. And this was very much one of those cases of riot cops out there to start a riot. But what's in the film, I think the title just sort of rings and echoes throughout the film and right down to today. Do the right thing. What do you do in the face of all of this? And what is it to do the right thing it goes through a lot of situations, people's lives, and all the complexity and contradiction of trying to live in a world where so for so many of these youth, they feel like they have no future and they're treated like garbage by the authorities. And so over the last year and a half, we've seen people doing the right thing in ways they haven't in decades, which is to face down this injustice and stand up and straighten their backs and refuse to bend in the face of it. And this has been a sort of an inspiration to not only myself, but to many, many people throughout society. And sort of the question that poses to all of us, and seeing this film again, just actually earlier today, the do the right thing, and what are you going to do in the face of all this? Because that's begun to change, and people have begun to do something, and now that that's posing a question to everybody in this room as well. What are you going to do, and how do you do the right thing? Because there's a fight going on to change the direction of things, and which side are you going to be on? And in that film, they go in, it's just a little heartbreaking because they go in these circles and there's different people who are got different, there's a guy trying to get a picture on the wall in a pizza shop, and he's, and there's something really legit, important about that, and at the same time the terms of it are just kind of off, and then all these petty beefs in the neighborhood then get refocused in a whole societal landscape when the police come in, and you can't help but see the echoes of Eric Garner and Radio Raheem when he's choked down, and people are saying he's gonna die, or when
Jordan Davis.
Sorry.
Jordan Davis.
Jordan Davis, yeah, it's like Eric Garner, Jordan Davis right there together, it's exactly, if people don't know, Jordan Davis was a kid in Florida who, this white guy, Michael Dunn, said he was playing his music too loud, so he emptied his firearm into the car with a bunch of teenagers in it and killed this kid, Jordan Davis. And this guy, Michael Dunn, was convicted not for killing Jordan Davis, but for endangering the other people around Jordan Davis who were in the car when he fired his weapon. Not for the person he killed. In other words, you should have killed them all.
Yeah, rap crap. That's what he called it, rap crap. He was claimed to have said, "I hate thug music," but he later said, no, rap crap.
Yeah.
Jamilah, Patricia touched on the media and how the media can and is or is not involved in shaping our perspective on this. What was very interesting for me to learn about was when the film came out, a lot of critics, a lot of Hollywood was saying that Spike Lee or the character of Mookie, which they identify with Spike, that throwing the trash can through the window, that was all about him wanting to incite riots across the country. They were encouraging people not to see the film, and in fact, a lot of white people did not go see the film because they thought there would be riots, because African Americans can't watch a movie and control themselves. They would burst into a riot, and it would be dangerous. And it's amazing that was part of the reaction to the film. What do you make of that then? How do you see things now, being at a very important major publication? What do you see as your role in the media?
Well, that's an accusation that's been leveled against Black people many times. The idea that if we're exposed to certain images and entertainment, that we are incapable of controlling ourselves, and that we are thus going to parrot exactly what we've seen in the film. So The Spook Who Sat by the Door was quickly taken out of theaters for fear that Black people would see what happened. It's a movie where a young Black man becomes the first Black member of the CIA, and he gets this desk job where he has very little to do of significance. He's like the chief of reproductions, which means he's making photocopies all day. And he takes the training that he receives because he's trained like the other agents, and he goes out into the community and gets some gang members and trains them into a Black Panther style liberation army. And they do launch a revolution. And so there was this idea that if Black people just simply saw that film, which I think came out in 1968, they were going to go out and do the exact same thing. So there were theaters that refused to show it, and it did not do very well commercially, and was kind of forgotten about until decades later. So, of course, I don't remember when Do the Right Thing came out because I'm only 31, but, you know, that we're hearing that, again, when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, and coverage of the protests have taken place in Baltimore and Ferguson, and there are politicians, people such as Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz, who are repeating this idea that if Black people continue to protest, if we continue to be exposed to these images of protest, that obviously what's going to happen is that there's going to be riots. And so the violence that's happened against a handful of police officers in this country, and there are always police killings. It's not something that does not happen. They typically happen during routine traffic stops. But the idea that continuing to talk about Black Lives Matter and to allow the police brutality movement to grow is going to lead to continued acts of violence against the police. And so really the activists, people like you, are responsible for the safety of police officers who have endangered the safety of Black and brown and poor people across this country for a very long time. As far as the media's responsibility and all of that goes, we've come a long way from when this film came out. I think that what took place in Ferguson in 2014 and how social media has democratized media voices and allowed people who would not traditionally be seen on the news at all, whether they're coming on as commentators, whether they're activists that are being asked to share their thoughts, or even members of the media like myself, has shifted the narrative in certain ways. And so you're not seeing quite as much anti-Black sentiment or people having consistent, the consistent unchecked ability to say these kids in the street are violent. What they're doing is wrong. If you see this movie, somebody's going to get harmed. We can't show this. I think that there is more balance, and then you have a 24-hour news network like Fox News, which is completely unbalanced and is parroting all that same anti-Black racism. And everyone has a story to tell, and everyone, you know, we have 24 hours of content to fill. So it's better, it's subjective. The fact that we're still saying names like Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and over and over and over again, that it's still happening, that there are still so many Radio Rahims, and Radio Rahim can be a 12-year-old boy or a 7-year-old girl asleep in her house, shows that we have a long way to go. But I do think that the media is a space that still criminalizes Black people, but does not have the ability to criminalize us in the way that they did when this film came out.
Patricia, do you have?
I was going to say, I actually think it's gotten much worse. The media has gotten much worse around. I mean, and I think that this film occurred at a time, and I'm not talking about going all the way back to Birth of a Nation, but I do think that there was a moment in time when the temperature of ordinary news outlets, the broadsheets, and of the traditional news networks were confined in what they could say by a code of ethics that doesn't exist anymore. And you didn't have, and this was, you know, this movie came out just at the cusp of the Central Park Jogger panic, just at the cusp of the Rodney King 24-hour images of sensational reality television around true crime. It was before cops. And so I think the evolution of traditional media ethics, which have completely evaporated with Fox, and not just on the right, but also on the left. I mean, MSNBC is, you know, it's enthusiastic, but it's also this unchecked river of words that isn't necessarily the same as investigative journalism. I think that dam has broken a long time ago, and in that sense, I think we're carried along by sensation in a way that didn't happen in the same intense, technologically driven way that you have now. And so I actually think that part of it has gotten worse. The conversation is round-the-clock hysteria in a way that didn't happen then. This was the beginning of it. This was the beginning of that
And I guess
racialization of media. But
that's the moment to which so when you're saying that being the beginning of the round-the-clock hysteria, so if I'm comparing that to now, I'd say that things are better only because at least there's some balance there, and so that we can at least push back on social media. We can push back online. There wasn't an Ebony website back then, so the way that we can respond to that hysteria, you know what I mean, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, I can write an op-ed for the Amsterdam News, or I could write something for the Chicago Defender, which was certainly important, but it wasn't necessarily going to reach someone who was in St. Louis or someone who was in San Francisco.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you on the mainstream media, but I also agree with you on that. I guess it just depends on how powerful mainstream media is. I mean, Marylin, maybe you can briefly tell us your case, but in watching Fox News talk about you and your case, speaking to your point, Patricia, I mean, I wanted to pick up my laptop and smash it to the ground. It was as if I was watching people from another planet talk. I didn't have to agree with them or not, but it was really like, it reminded me of a great Oscar Wilde quote, "It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances." I mean, why are we learning to write letters to people in prison, which you were telling us a story about that even at dinner, Patricia, but the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, and it has about a quarter of the world's prisoners. So who are the kids supposed to write to? I mean, you got a pretty good chance that you're writing to someone in prison. Can you just briefly touch on what you're doing right now and Fox News and the media?
Absolutely. So just to give a brief recap of my case, or the case that I had against Orange Board of Education. And Orange is a small city in New Jersey, right outside of Newark. And so it's a predominantly black, demographically it's predominantly black and Latino. And so I was a third grade public school teacher. It was my first year teaching in Orange School District. And so for Black History Month, for the month of February, we actually explored different black leaders who have done great work in their communities. And so we specifically looked at leaders that are often not covered in our mainstream curricula, also not covered in our textbooks in social studies. And so we looked at names like Ella Baker, Ida B. Wells, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, and one of those leaders happened to be Mumia Abu-Jamal. And so my students took a really great liking to Mumia's story, and the work that he did as a journalist with the Black Panther Party, and also as an independent radio voice and journalist in the city of Philadelphia. And so my students were captivated by his story for multiple reasons, right? And talking about his leadership skills in the sense that he is a published author, and those books were published while he was incarcerated. And so this being a community that at large are there's a very high percentage of ex-offenders in Orange, New Jersey. And so a lot of these students, the majority of my students, know someone who's incarcerated, have a family member who's incarcerated, or have someone in close proximity in their lives that have been incarcerated in the past. And so this was a topic that really grasped them at the heart, right, and at the mind. And so when the month of April came around, when Mumia became very ill, Mumia Abu-Jamal is a political prisoner, the hospital wouldn't allow him to see family members, or wouldn't allow him to have anyone visit him, and he wasn't getting the proper medical treatment that he needed for his diabetes and hepatitis C. And so my students, when I shared this news with them, they were angry. I mean, they were frustrated. They couldn't believe that a human being could be blocked from seeing their family while they were deathly ill. And so one of my students asked, can we write letters to Mumia Abu-Jamal to make him feel better? And so another student shouted out, yeah, let's write get well letters. And so I was like, of course we can. And they wrote the letters, and they were very passionate about it. They drew beautiful pictures for Mumia. And so when they were done working on these letters, one of my students asked me, Ms. Zuniga, do you think these letters are going to be delivered to Mumia? I mean, can you get them to him? And I looked at her, and I was kind of like, I'm not sure if that's going to happen, right? And so I know folks who have worked on the campaign to bring Mumia home, folks who have been involved in Mumia's case for a very long time, but at the time I was like, how are we going to get these letters to him? I mean, he's ill. They won't even let family members see him. And so I spoke to a professor here at Baruch College, Johanna Fernandez, and she said, of course we can get those letters to him. And those letters were in his hands that following Sunday. And so when he saw the letters, he actually stood up. He hadn't stood up in a very long time, so emotionally it gave him strength that he wasn't able to have before. And so it touched his heart that these were third graders writing these letters to him. And of course it was their language, it was their words that they shared with him that captivated him to take these pictures that day that he wasn't able to stand up and take in the past. And so before I knew it, I was on spring break laying on the beach in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and I started getting notifications on my phone about, this teacher needs to be fired immediately on my Twitter and on my Facebook. People were tagging me, and then I find out I'm on Fox News. My face was already plastered everywhere. I was labeled as a cop killer lover teacher. Very, very demeaning, very dehumanizing, very criminalizing. But most of all, what I didn't understand about the media and Fox News in particular is this attack of character, right? And so they don't know my students. They don't know me. They don't know what we're studying. They don't know anything about our stories. They don't know our backgrounds. They don't know where we're from. They don't know our families. They don't know anything personal about us, but yet there's this immediate reaction to attack and dehumanize folks via media, right? And so there's no doubt in my mind that I was criminalized and dehumanized because of my proximity to blackness, in the sense that this was a black community. These were predominantly black students who were writing a black political prisoner, Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's internationally known, and folks have been fighting for his case for a very long time. There's no doubt in my mind that that's the reason why it blew up. I mean, it had nothing to do with my professionalism as an educator, although they tried to frame it in that sense. But yeah, I mean, what's not told about my case is that the Fraternal Order of Police called my school district in Orange, New Jersey, and threatened them to fire me. And so that's something that's not shown on media, right? Unless I'm interviewed, which no mainstream media has come out and interviewed me personally. It's all been independent journalists.
I mean, you could really sense that in watching it. They have no sense of what your life might be, and it goes back to the film, questions about what is black, what is blackness, and there's this scene where Mookie points out to Pino, John Turturro's character, the racist in the pizzeria, that, who are your favorite entertainers, who are your favorite, and he lists all these great African-American entertainers and sports stars, but they're not black for him. They're some other thing. They're more than black, and Patricia, you've written about this, about how you've been labeled not black, for purposes of inclusion, or you've been labeled black for purposes of exclusion by colleagues. What are the ways that blackness has been defined or is being defined, and how do you view this, especially in that context of that theme, which I thought was so very fresh still?
Can I actually divert your question for just a minute?
Sure.
Because I wanted to follow up on what was just said, because I think the question of expression that this raises is something which gets a little bit lost in the discussion about whether or not this is an attack on somebody individually. I mean, as painful as this, and Fox does this so well, anybody who comes within its purview gets slashed in terms of their personality. I think it's entirely predictable that a public school teacher who calls Mumia Abu-Jamal a political prisoner rather than a criminal is going to be under attack from Fox and from this particular kind of media. That is not a surprise. His identity has been controversial since the beginning. What I think that going down that pathway loses is the human rights issue of any prisoner. Let's assume not just that he's a leader or however you want to call him, with all the vexed definitions of what his, what Mumia Abu-Jamal may or may not stand for, misses the issue that we were discussing at dinner, which is when I was growing up in this country, in the 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 7th grade, we wrote to prisoners, we wrote to people in mental asylums, we wrote regardless of whether or not they were heroic within the category of politics. We wrote because they were human beings. And we wrote because they were confined and because they were shut-ins. And we wrote because they were doing their time. And it was part of an exercise of recognizing both their humanity and their citizenship. And this is a very difficult point, because that means that you have to acknowledge their humanity, even not when they're heroic and not when they're leaders, but when they are vile, awful human beings who are murderers or who are psychotic or who are something else. And that, I think, is a much more difficult political stance to take. And we've lost that. And so you have to cast anything you do with these children as being almost, as being about writing to a hero or writing to somebody who connects from their hearts. When that, to me, as a lawyer, is entirely beside the point. Because this is about the limits of state power over the bodies it is incarcerated. And that it should extend to all incarcerated. And again, this is not to make them necessarily heroic. That's the hard part. They are not all heroes behind bars. But to recognize their humanity puts a limit and acknowledges the need for a connection. And the lack of that connection is raced, it seems to me, at this point in our history. It is very much about race and geography and everything else, but it is dangerous, and that's why I find the figure of Mumia Abu-Jamal so intriguing, because so many of the constraints that we have around First Amendment rights imposed on people writing letters or prisoners writing out, the ability to communicate with people behind these walls is a way of not having a sense of accountability for their fate behind those walls. And again, this is not to lionize. You don't have to lionize people who may deserve to be separated from society, but you have to know what's going on. You have to let them write, and you have to be able to write back and forth. And so this is why their stance as children of the incarcerated or the incarcerated being able to report out to the media what's going on, and the constraints on that have occurred, particularly around Mumia Abu-Jamal, makes it, I think, an object lesson in what the really difficult part about the First Amendment. It's one thing to say, I have my right to call you a fool in public, which is sort of like the political correctness argument. But this, it seems to me, is the heart of what is so difficult about our grappling with the First Amendment. And so that's why I think your case is really important. And as a public school teacher, what are the limits? What are the appropriate limits on having political discussions with children in a public space about these kinds of civic constraints and civic obligations? So that's how I would, I think that's we should not forget that this is not just about them dumping on you. You are an icon of something that's much larger and more difficult, and really much harder that we don't really get to.
Well, yeah, if I can respond really quickly, I obviously agree. Most of what I speak about is the fact that this is so much larger than me. This is so much larger than what my students did. This is so much larger than Mumia, but so much, in so many ways, representative of our culture today, right? And so when we look at what happened with my case, I'm not the only teacher who has been fired for acts like this in this past year. It just so happened that this story, just like Trayvon Martin's story, just like Michael Brown's story, caught media attention and was able to give us a platform to have these conversations, thankfully and gratefully, but at the same time, at the expense of something that was very much dehumanizing to so many folks, right? And not just to me as a teacher, but to the whole community. But I think it speaks very much so to your question in the sense that, that scene when Mookie was talking to him and he was saying, you do realize, these are all black folks who you are talking about, right? And he responds by saying, well, no, but they're not just black, they're way more than black. And so this idea that this dehumanization of specifically the black community and black individuals is this idea that either you're subhuman or you're superhuman, right? You're not human. You're either less than human and you're incarcerated and you're not worth of that. Your humanization is completely stripped of you, or you're superhuman, right? You're Michael Jackson, you're a star, you're amazing. So that speaks to this idea of dehumanization at large, right? And it doesn't just take one form.
I also think there's something in the film that does make it, to what you're saying, very universal, which I think is this theatricality to the film, the stylization of the film, that it is on one day, that the walls aren't red, they're really red. You know, that there's, there's the mayor, there's Mother Sister, there's a Robinson jersey, and there's Larry Bird jersey, and there is something, so I think it would have just been, one, I like the abstractness of that it does make it very universal, but I think the film would have just been way too painful maybe to watch if it had not taken one step removed into humor, into color, into style. Noche, what do you think of the Wall of Fame? The Wall of Fame in the movie and Sal's Pizzeria.
Oh.
What's your stance on that? I think it's very tough situation. Very, like, as I watch it again, you were talking about do the right thing, which
right.
I think we're going to come back to again and again. It's like, what is the right thing in that situation? Who?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the wall itself, the fact that, I mean, one of the lines in the theme song to the movie, in Fight the Power, is, most of my heroes don't appear on no stamps. Sample a look back, and if you check, you'll find nothing but rednecks for 400 years. And this gets to the point that what was being fought out wasn't about Sal and Bugs, it's just, this whole history, and this is connected to the conversation about blackness. The whole history of this country, freedom and democracy, First Amendment, all the amendments' rights, has always presumed the exclusion of people who are not identified as white. I mean, that's always been the history of this country. And so down to today. I mean, it's interesting. I thought you were going to go to the other scene at the end of the movie where the Korean shop owner is saying, "No, I'm not white. I'm black."
Yes.
And he's Korean, but there's this whole point of like these sort of categories created by the whole legacy and history of this country of white supremacy, and the whole there's a book called The Law is a White Dog, in which they the book kind of takes apart these legal categories of prisoners as something other than human. They don't even have the same protections as pets, for example. So they don't have the human protections. They're not exactly animals, and so they're totally dehumanized and mystified and created into this whole legal category of criminal. That is, their humanity is not acknowledged, and even their being as living beings with needs is not acknowledged. So in terms of the wall of fame, coming back to that, it does get back to the thing of like when you look at a situation, you can't just look at what's happened that day, and that's what's concentrated so much in that scene that's happening all in one day in this movie. Is that so much history comes to a point where, and all the frustrations that people are dealing with and outrage that's bubbling over. It really is not about Sal and his pizzeria. It's about hundreds of years of the situation of black people. And I think in the beginning, you have Smiley, talking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and how they're both dead now, but we still have to fight the same battles. And this is what sort of opens up the movie and casts this whole shadow over these sort of what seems like just people going about their lives in these local disputes. And what's actually being fought out, though, are these larger things. And the movie starts with that and also ends with.
It's interesting because Smiley forced his way into the movie. That actor just wanted to be in the film, and he kept hassling Spike, like, put me in the movie. And finally, he's like, well, make a role for yourself that fits in this movie. And it's amazing because it's hard to imagine the movie without him, but it wasn't really part of the script. He made his way in there, and it just like perfectly, was such a perfect vehicle for the film, and he's always hanging around. Interestingly, Spike Lee says in his commentary to the film that he thought that Sal was correct, that it was his business, and that until African Americans had their own businesses, they should have let him do what he wanted to do. And I don't necessarily agree or disagree with him, but one of the things that's so, I think, engaging in the film is you actually never know what the right thing is, and that's so well articulated in these contradictory quotes that end the film. Jamilah, do you think that Sal is a racist?
I think Spike's comment is interesting, and maybe more passively racist as opposed to somebody who's going to go home at night and say, God, I hate these people, but just that it did not occur to him, well, I have all these young people that are coming into this pizzeria, I have some of them working for me, even putting up a couple of pictures of people who look like them might be a show of good faith, that I am a part of this community, and this is our pizzeria, it's not just mine, it's not just about, people with whom I identify, but that's a level of thought that most people don't really get to unless somebody's pulled their card and said, hey, it would be good if you represented us. And his response to being challenged on that said a lot about who he is. I do think that, as Spike said, we have but so much control when we don't own the business, and it is important for Black people to own businesses and for Black people to own businesses in Black communities. As someone who lives in Bedford-Stuyvesant now, and I've been there for 8 years, and was compelled to come there on some level because of Spike Lee and this film and his work, and all the great things you hear about Brooklyn in rap music. It's interesting to see business owners come in that are very different from Sal, because Sal, of course, being a native New Yorker and being Italian, versus people who may have grown up in the Midwest or on the West Coast who now have the means to come into Bedford-Stuyvesant and open a little Italian bistro or a French bakery.
The Larry Bird character.
Right.
John Savage's role.
Exactly. And
Gentrification, which he was so ahead of the time in this film on. What's so interesting about this is Sal is, he does say these people, like I fed these people, and there's this very kind of aggressive shot where Mookie is facing in one direction as Sal is right behind him, talking to him about how he's going to lose his job and be out on the street with his hoodlum buddies. Mm-hmm. It's very, I agree with you. I think Sal is racist, but some part of him seems to have a heart. It leads me to, I would like someone to talk a little bit about microaggressions. I think it's something that I didn't know about until recently, and I don't know how many. Are you guys familiar with? Probably a lot of people here are familiar with microaggressions, but Sal to me was a lot about that, and maybe someone can talk about that.
I do want I do want to chime in on it. It's the same question, but like Sal clearly has some racist. He at the end of there calls them these niggers and all this vile shit comes flowing out of his mouth. But I think the movie also kind of makes clear, like, the problem is not Sal, and if you and it's not good enough the problem is not whether or not you have a heart for people, that just doesn't deal with it. What people are up against, you have to actually confront that and be part of solving that. That's, I guess, the wall thing. Although again, the wall is kind of like a microcosm. Is like what people are up against. It's not enough for you to not be racist about it. It's not enough for you to check your, it's a great thing if white people are trying to not be racist and check their privilege, and that's very important. But if you're not part of actually fighting to take down the very structures of white supremacy that have kept people locked up and beaten down so long for, so much, then you're not actually solving the very things that are causing these kinds of eruptions, and you have to, you have to play a role in that. And so I do think there's this thing. Sal is clearly, I think, race. I mean, I don't think that's I don't think that's a controversial statement. I mean, he says all that vile shit at the end. He's trying to do different, and maybe he has some better inclinations and doesn't want to be, but he comes up in this country, and you have all the ways of thinking that go along with it. And again, I do think it comes to there. What's being fought out in that little microcosm and everything like that is, this gets back to the conversation too today about implicit bias that people talk about all the time. I think this is what you're getting at in terms of microaggressions. But there's this whole skit on the Daily Show about are all cops racist, and they even get one of these sheriffs or something like that from Madison, Wisconsin, on talking about how yes, cops are all racist. They have these implicit bias. We have to do these training programs, and they have these training programs for 6 years of trying to train the racism out of these cops, and they're still murdering black and brown people. The very cops who are being trained in that way, because that's real and that's a problem, but it's not. It doesn't even get at the point. And so I think that's another thing when you talk about doing the right thing. When you're in a situation like that, it's not enough for you to sort of, and then, yeah, it's true. Okay, if you own a business, you have rights and you can do what you want with your business. Who gives a fuck? Excuse me. It's like, that's not the, point. It goes, It also goes to, frankly, to Baltimore, where people were more concerned about broken glass and broken windows and the broken neck
Yeah.
of Freddie Gray.
Well,
Yeah.
I do want to get to some questions, but it is interesting because a lot of people, especially white audiences, were so concerned about the broken window, and they seem to have forgotten someone was killed.
Mhm.
I was just going to say, implicit bias is also, I mean, that's Claude Steele's work. It comes from Claude Steele's work. It comes from, a whole line of social psychology that shows that everybody has the biases of this particular culture, including black people.
Yeah.
And I actually thought that one of the things I really appreciated about this movie was how the attempt that Spike Lee made not to divide it easily among white racism as opposed to Korean racism as opposed to black racism or black, because there was also a lot of conversation among the black elders sitting on the street corner that if they came out of the mouth of a white guy would be racist. I mean, this I thought unsettled a lot of the traditional categories. And I thought that the wall in Sal's was really matched by the red wall with Tawana was telling the truth. I mean, there were walls all over this movie with messages and identities carved into them. And one major distinction between the hipster or the Larry Bird character with the
John
bicycle,
Savage, yeah.
yes, and Sal is the history of Bed-Stuy or the South Bronx, which is that he represents a community that was there for a very long period of time. I mean, the Italians who grew up in this neighborhood saw the neighborhood change. He's somebody who's probably stayed there, as opposed, and that, I think, presupposes some knowledge of the history of that kind of Italian community in New York City, which was also considered colored at one time during the immigration laws, and which was, I think, is still, until very recently, under the laws of inclusion in New York, were actually included under affirmative action laws in CUNY. So Italian Americans were, and I heard the Korean shopkeeper at the end saying, not that I'm black, but we are the same. So in that sense,
He says both.
appeal-
He says both.
Did he
yeah.
say, does he say both? Yeah.
He says I'm
But that's
black.
what stuck with me. Is
Yeah.
we are the same, and so that was a political appeal, not simply about color. It was a
Right.
political appeal about stance, and in that sense, Sal is.
You could
he's
also interpret it
an interesting, complicated category.
I also, you could interpret the Korean as just, he want to save his store too, you don't know.
Yes.
Which I think is so good because you don't know. I want to get to questions from you guys, but very quickly, just so you know, because Patricia mentioned it, Tawana told the truth. You may recall a scene where Spike and his sister, which is actually played by his sister, are standing at a wall that says Tawana told the truth. This is Tawana Brawley at age 15, 1987, accused 6 white men. She was 14 at
She
that?
was 14 when
14.
she was found. Yeah.
Accused 6 white men of raping her in 1987. It was later revealed to be a, quote, hoax, which is a very weird word. Patricia, you said that a cast of extraordinarily self-interested men did all of Tawana Brawley speaking for her. I would like to come back to that because the idea of this and that Spike put it in the film, and I was watching his press conference from that time, and it seemed at that time he wasn't even quite sure what he himself made of it, but I think his instinct was dead on to put it there, even though the idea that she told the truth, even though it was, quote, a hoax, I find that so,
It's
his
unclear
instinct was
what happened to her.
dead
I mean,
on there.
Yeah, and the thing about Tawana Brawley that still gets me, I got myself into all kinds of trouble for saying this, but I think it's easier to say in today's world. She was 14 years old when she was found in the backyard of her apartment building, wrapped in a garbage bag, and no clothes, smeared with dog feces and with cigarette burns on her body. Now, she accused people, and that was never proved. And so in that sense, I don't know what happened. And Al Sharpton did a great deal of talking for her, and there were some lawyers who did a great deal of talking for her. But nobody should have been talking for her, and Child Protective Services should have taken this child away a long time ago. She'd been beaten up by her father. Her father had served 7 years for actually murdering his first wife. Tawana Brawley's mother was the woman he was with at that time. She had run away repeatedly. She was a child who may have indeed lied, but children who have been abused and who are found in that condition frequently lie about their condition, and that was never ever taken into account in the press. And so the way in which that argument got divvied up, which was that she lied to get a white police officer, because she
Yes.
accused a white police officer of being the one who raped her, and versus, she represents black woman defiled, was so reductive. And she never opened her mouth. This was what other people said she said. She never spoke publicly throughout all of this. And I think it was the most horrible, horrible travesty. Again, in terms of how the system worked. Her name as a minor should never have been in the public the way it was. Her name alone should not have been in the public to that degree. And
I'm still baffled Universal released the movie. As a filmmaker, my mind keeps going back to what amazing courage and guts he had to do it, and that they released the film. Let's get a question from the audience, because I have like 3 more hours of questions, and probably you guys are like, any questions?
Hi, I don't know if it's as much a question as a statement, but it's interesting perspective, because you talked about seeing it as innocent. I was really brought back to how it's so true, and the panel is addressing things in sort of a linear way, and how things are still occurring. But I think we want to look at it more secular, and the fact that Ossie Davis was in the movie, and that we fought these things for so long, and I think Spike Lee made such a big effort to show everyone's racism. And you said, is Sal a racist? I would argue everyone's a racist. It's what way you address your own preconceived notions and how you act upon them. And I think we want to act together and do the right thing. The phrase came from the mayor, Ossie Davis, whose character constantly said, if everybody could see each other's point of view and work together, even stood up and tried to stop the riot and said it wasn't Sal's fault. And I don't think Mookie was trying to start a riot. I think he was trying to break an unbearable tension in the moment. And in a way, I think by doing it, whether it was his intention or not, he saved Sal and the sons. And those were my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think he was trying to start a riot either. I think a lot of what you said makes sense to me as well.
I do want to address like the linearity and the thing of everybody being racist. I'll start with the last one first. We live in a racist, white supremacist country, and that's what America is and has been for hundreds of years. Okay, now they've got people thinking all kinds of crazy, and they tell people lies about each other too. They get them whipped up against each other. Immigrants are coming in and taking our jobs, and they're all, you have fascist idiots like Donald Trump talking about how they're all criminals and blah blah blah, this and that. And then you have immigrants when you come to this country. I have a friend who said the first word he learned in English was nigger, and that's what you don't want to be. Because black people are lazy. And you hear this from African immigrants as well. Black people are lazy and they don't know how to work hard. They've been here for hundreds of years and they don't have anything. It's like all this stuff that gets whipped up, but it is in a society, in a country, and under the dictates of a white supremacist system. And so, yes, people develop all kinds of racist ideas and caricatures that are largely promoted by the dominant institutions of society, frankly. like the media the media is not just, poor standards. They're crude propaganda instruments today. That's just, MSNBC and CNN and Fox News, maybe they represent different parts of the White House, but they really they almost repeat, even MSNBC almost repeat whatever is coming from the White House or the police officers whenever they repeat a line. And so I did want to address that, and I do think that comes out in this film. But even if it didn't, frankly, that's the reality. And and then just this thing on the linearity versus the cycle. I will say, it's right to point out that it's not just a linear line of things continuing, and your point about Ossie Davis, because there's a continuum, and then there's also, transformation and development, and things are in a much worse situation today than when the film came out. You were talking about the increased militarization of the police. The number of killings by police officers has skyrocketed, since that film came out, and partly because of the battles that were going on then around the Central Park Five, the Wolf Pack going through Central Park, referring to these Black and Latino youth who had committed no crime. And I just didn't want to bring out this thing of Black women also doing, women in general, but being violated, and then the authorities don't give a damn about them. It was used as a vehicle to criminalize and attack Black youth and Latino youth in that case of the Central Park Five. And you look at Kimberly McKenna, and the women with mental illness stripped naked by prison guards, 7 of them in biohazard suits with their knees in her chest, tasering her over and over again after she cries, "You promised you wouldn't kill me." And then the courts say that the officers all conducted themselves professionally and with the courtesy that you would expect from our officers. This is again, this is not just linear. It's actually gotten far worse. You talk about the incarceration rates. It was like if you were to go back to the rates of incarceration 30, 40 years ago, you'd have to release half the prison population or something, some outrageous number like that. And I will say, just close on this in case we don't get a chance to do this again. If you can't, I saw a number of people coming in with the card for Rise Up October, and I just wanted people to know that in terms of doing the right thing, there's a chance for you right now to be part of doing the right thing. 100 family members of people murdered by the police are coming to New York this Thursday to lead 3 days of activity to polarize this country and say this police terror and mass incarceration must stop. Which side are you going to be on?
Patricia, did you?
I just wanted to say that that said, I thought the speaker's point, I wanted to underscore that I thought the film was actually very careful about not making one character represent racism or the other. Yeah. That the earlier point about that this was a movie about structural obstacles that trapped everybody in this film, and so the distribution of blame, so to speak, wasn't as clear as simply saying here's the icon. I mean, there were certainly reductive, almost medieval characters of everybody had a character name almost.
The mayor, Smiley.
The mayor, mother, sister, Smiley, and so forth. It was very Shakespearean in that sense. It was almost West Side Story-ish, but it wasn't reductive in the sense that there was one embodiment of good on one side and evil on the other, and even of our own grace. I thought that he made an attempt at any rate. Successful is another question, but I thought he made a very concerted attempt to point at the structures of
larger
what
people are all trapped up in.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a question.
Something that keeps coming to my mind is the history of the minstrel show and kind of our own human need for storytelling and kind of the intersection with that and race and thinking about race and trying to define it in a public way through storytelling, and how sometimes that gets mixed up. And when I look back at like the history of minstrel shows and even the more modern kind of the legacy of it, of like say Denzel Washington winning his Oscar for Training Day, I see that there's this complexity that I'm curious to hear people comment on about maybe some of the difficulty that a lot of the dialogue getting stopped in the media, and perhaps there's something to that legacy of storytelling being mixed with conversations about race and ending up with these kind of exaggerated images that honestly are very complicated to unpack in what is becoming a very kind of soundbite based media. So we do end up getting these news flashes of these sensationalized, simplified stories that to me is that in my mind, I'm connecting it back to these kind of very archetypal stereotypes that I think are very entrenched in our popular culture.
Just to say, I'm actually very curious, Jamilah, what you think being at Ebony, but at a publication in the media. But just to say, I agree with Patricia that he's taken these things, but I think he's modernized them. It is very hard to understand where people stand in the film. I completely agree that he's I think also very quite hard on African Americans in the film, and he's updated a lot of these things. from West Side Story, from Shakespeare, from Night of the Hunter, that great film with Mitchum where he has love and hate tattooed on his knuckles. Actually, here he's updated it and done it in a very new way, in a very fresh way. But do you have any feeling about that in terms of the gentleman's comment and the media and representation in film or in other areas from earlier until now?
There's a lot to your comment and to your question. There are certain representations of various groups of people that we see over and over again, and oftentimes that's because they make the larger body or the dominant body feel comfortable, right? So it was very unlikely that Denzel Washington would have won an Oscar for portraying Malcolm X. And I think that many of us would argue that he gave a phenomenal performance as Malcolm X, and maybe even a better performance as Malcolm X as he did the lead character in Training Day. But one character represents something that makes a whole lot of people very uncomfortable, and the other represents an image of black manhood that makes a lot of people comfortable, even though you could have very easily cast a white actor in that role in Training Day. It wasn't about him being black. It wasn't a black story per se. It was Denzel being a phenomenal actor who can play pretty much anything. He can play me in a movie probably and give an Oscar-worthy performance. You know, and I think that Spike certainly used a lot of tropes in this film. You have your spicy Latina girlfriend and your, you know, Brooklyn Italian guy. I mean, these were images to people who had maybe never been to New York City, could identify as New Yorker-ish type people or ethnics, and this is how they act. And, you know, I think part of that is the genius of Spike Lee. But that comment makes me think back to what the first question or comment made reference to in terms of everyone being racist. And I'm really inclined to push back when I hear that phrasing, because I don't think that everyone is racist. I think that Spike did a really wonderful job at highlighting how everyone can be prejudiced and how everyone's implicit bias shows up. So the bias that people had against Sal, and then the bias that Sal had against Mookie and the police officers, and everybody has bias. But the biases that certain people have don't harm the lives or the livelihood of other people. So I could be incredibly biased towards white people, but there's very limited, there's a limited effect that's going to have. So perhaps I wouldn't hire someone for a job. If I'm a taxi driver, I might not pick them up, but it's unlikely that their entire lives could be upended by my bias, right? And even if you have a collective group of people, if you say most African Americans have bias against white people or they have favorable bias towards their own kind, again, that's not going to lead to white folks being funneled into the system of mass incarceration. It's not going to lead to the defunding of white schools. It's not going to lead to abuse at the hands of the police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think it's important that while we recognize the bias and the bigotry even and the prejudice of these characters that are kind of these, you know, hyper ethnic stereotypes that Spike played to in this film, that we just are clear that everything doesn't get better by us just being nice to each other. I think there's this idea, this kind of sentiment that comes out often that, well, the black guy's being racist and the white guy's being racist and everyone was just nicer to each other, things would be better. You may have a better climate to work in, so it may be more fun to go to Sal's and there's a picture of Michael Jackson and Michael Jordan on the wall and everyone's getting along, but that doesn't mean that when Mookie goes out into the street, he's not going to encounter a police officer that very well could do the same thing to him that happened to Radio Raheem.
I think it's a very good point, and it gets to that when you watch the debates where the candidates don't know what to say when they say, do Black Lives Matter? And they want to say, yes, do Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. They always want to shift it back to that.
That you can't even just simply say that.
They don't know how to answer that one, yeah.
And Bernie Sanders, going first in the debate, gave such a great answer. He opened the door for everyone to just kind of parrot that and say, yes, Black Lives Matter, as do all lives, but I understand why this statement is being made, and that the rest of them.
But then even if they do say it and they start parroting it, then you start to wonder, you know, what the value of it starts to become if they're just parroting it, and then maybe a cycle continues, unfortunately. Any question? Because I still have a couple more, but I'm eager to hear from you guys. Yes.
You guys touched on it briefly, and I'm just curious. While this panel is together, well, I guess it could go as well as the violence that police commit on a daily basis. Do you think the mass incarceration situation, along with the violence, could really be remedied judicially? Or is it something that needs a little bit more of a, I hate to say it, but it's realistic, a drastic measure?
Say the last thing again.
Something that actually needs
I just didn't hear
reminiscent
what
of
you
a
said.
grassroots rebellion. Because I really don't see the white system that has been built on, you know, a lot of this prison mentality that's been going on, and all these people that eat off of that prison population and the money it generates by, you know, judicially, because it would like almost dislodge the system that they've already instilled. So I'm asking if you think it actually could be remedied through the courts, or it was something that.
I mean, I'll let the panelists, just to give it context of the film, you know, part of what Spike wanted to do was to get rid of Ed Koch. And in the end of the film, you hear this, you hear, you know, you hear the radio DJ talking about signing up and getting registered to vote, you know. And that's because he wanted to get Dinkins into office. And I think that was a big part of the Million Man March. You know, when that first happened, was getting a lot of people registered to vote. And Noche, we were on the walk up here, we were talking about how I found it very frightening that I don't think a lot of people knew that it just happened again last weekend. It was barely covered by the mainstream media. It was as if nothing had happened. But I'm not saying that's an answer, but certainly I think one of the many things in the film was his desire to get rid of Ed Koch, and who knows if the film had a part in that. We could at least just say yes, because it would, you know, maybe the film was able to help at least get rid of Ed Koch. But Patricia, do you want to start on this one, or do you have a feeling about it, or Noche?
I definitely have a lot to say about this one. Look, I agree with you. It's look, well, just start with a simple one. It's supposed to be illegal to murder people, but this is what's happening every day, you know, and it gets back to the thing of people are not considered human beings, and that's not just a legal problem or a judicial problem, and frankly, even legal and judicial problems and corrections or whatever don't happen in the terms of the courts. You know, like you didn't have segregation and then integration because all of a sudden the laws changed and the Supreme Court decided, realized, wait, we misread this one line. No, there was a whole, civil rights struggle, and people put their lives on the line, and people gave their lives, and they faced brutality and beatings to go straight up against the violence that was used to enforce all of this. And so without that, nothing is possible. And you know, I read the voting thing at the end a little differently, or I thought it was the same as the rest of the movie, where there was a lot that you had to fight to try to see, you know, and interpret and compare to the larger context, because, and maybe it's the fact that you're seeing it, you know, so many years after it's been produced, where, you know, you say this whole thing of people vote, and then here we are, you know, it's 20 years later or more, you know, and things have gotten worse. You know, it was the Million Man's March, and there was a whole move to register to vote, and here we have a black president, black attorney general, black head of Homeland Security, not one federal prosecution of a killer cop for killing black and brown people, not one. You know, and with all the, you know, agreements with the police departments and investigations that say, oh, surprise, the police mistreat black people, we didn't know. All of that has actually amounted to nothing. In fact, it's amounted to the Department of Justice saying, you know, in more or less word for word this language: no evidence can be brought against a police officer to disprove their subjective belief that their life is in danger. In other words, all you have to do is say you're afraid of black people, and it's free. You can get away with murder. This is not, there's no legal correction here. This is a whole, there needs to be we were talking earlier too about the Tamir Rice, you know, situation, where you can look at that video of less than 2 seconds, police officers who have been told on the radio that there is a minor playing with what is probably a toy gun, in less than 2 seconds jump out of the car and blow this kid away. They tackle his sister to the ground when she comes.
The caller said that, but
The dispatcher
the
said it.
dispatcher didn't actually communicate to the police officers that
Okay.
he was a minor or that it was probably a toy. That I just want to qualify
Sure.
that.
Fine.
But
Okay, but you look at that
Doesn't-
video
yeah, it
and,
doesn't-
and yeah, to have an investigations come out and say that this is reasonable behavior is just insane. So we need to be unreasonable, and there does need to be rebellion and resistance, and that's the only way there's a possibility for for change on any level. And I myself, I work with plenty of people who are not coming from the standpoint of revolution, but I am a revolutionary, and I think this country has had hundreds of years to do right, and they have done wrong after wrong, of slavery and genocide, Jim Crow and a new Jim Crow and genocide down to today. And I think it's going to take a whole new legal system and political structures to enforce that, and it's going to take a revolution to put that into place where our police, this is what our leader Bob Avakian says, when we have our police on the street, we would sooner have our own police gunned down and killed than to take one of the lives of the people, because that's what it's supposed to mean to protect and serve. You go and you put your own life on the line, not what they do every day, which is put the lives of our people on the line.
I'm just curious what anyone thinks about the end of the film where, after all that's happened, Spike shows up and wants his pay. And he and Sal have this interaction. Not only he does get his pay, but he also collects the $200, which he tossed back at Sal. And I've seen the film so many times, and I cannot wrap my head around what I think of it, what might have been the meaning of it, and I'm just curious. I mean, I understand he wants his money. He's got a kid. That's very, very important. And that's a lot of money. $250 is a lot of money. But I find the scene, I don't quite fully grasp it. Not that I think it's not a good scene. I like the scene. Especially that he picks up the final $200. Anyone have a feeling about that?
I mean, it's why I think the movie is so interesting, because it's complex. I mean, because he doesn't say throughout this movie, there was an echo. It isn't just do the right thing. There are a number of instances where he says do this or do that, and I think the last iteration of it is when Mookie, the character Mookie, says, "Well, you do what you've got to do," and so it almost ends on this sense of we're going to do what we have to do, and the two of them are almost reconciling because each of them has done what they have to do,
Yes.
and it's not necessarily the right thing. I thought it ended on a really kind of interesting ambiguity of what's right or what's wrong.
Yeah. Which leads to the two quotes in the end, right?
Yeah, which puts
Right.
the peaceful Malcolm X or MLK versus
Right.
Malcolm X
And
right up against each other. Yeah.
in talking about Zimmerman being exonerated simply because, as you had mentioned, Trayvon Martin was seen as interchangeable, or no better than a man who had actually broken into Olivia Bertalon's home. That Trayvon Martin was not a victim, but that he was a thug, a perpetrator, a defendant, that he had already been found guilty, that his death was his inevitable destiny. I say this, I don't even have a question. The film, the lasting powers, I just do not know what is the right thing. Any last comments about this, the ending of the film, the two quotes?
Yeah, I think it highlights, like you said, the complexity of our culture, the complexity of the state in which our country is in which the world is in. And so I really appreciate the fact that that Spike Lee was able to do that. I mean, the idea of the quote, do the right thing, reminds me back of a class that I took at Teachers College. I took a class on the school to prison pipeline, and ironically they had a CO come in and speak to us about his experience in the prisons, in juvenile detention centers, I should say. And he kept reiterating this, do the right thing. You just have to do the right thing. And so eventually I just got so aggravated, and I raised my hand and asked them, what is the right thing? I mean, what do you even define as the right thing, right? When our communities are so divided, destroyed, attacked on so many different levels, they're so multi-layered and so multifaceted. I mean, how do you even tell someone that there's good and there's evil and that you need to do the right thing? I mean, what does that mean? Without definition, it holds no meaning.
How do you teach your kids?
Right? How do you teach your kids?
How do you? I'm asking. I'm very curious. How you do it?
Yeah, I think the film really got me to thinking about this idea that, as the gentleman was sharing earlier, this idea of narratives and stories and which stories are told, right? And so there's so many different narratives that are told in this film. This idea that it almost represented the American dream in so many ways. Sal was an Italian man that probably came from an Italian immigrant family, right? And so they were able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and live the American dream because they worked hard. And then you have this black community coming in and destroying his hard work and his work ethic, which is really just in the context of this myth of meritocracy that's supposed to work in our country that doesn't really work to our advantage as people of color, and specifically for black communities. I mean, it's so destructive, right? And so even the Baltimore riots, you see folks, well, why are the media is portraying as, why are these folks destroying their communities, right? That's what you saw in Do the Right Thing. They were destroying their community. Why would they do that? Why would they do such a thing? And so I'm interested in how these narratives are not just told and shared in media, but how are they portrayed in our textbooks, right? What are the immigrant stories that we see in our textbooks? How are our children learning these things in the classroom? And so for me as a teacher, I see it very much so as this idea that we need to, as educators, and we're all teachers to a certain extent, we need to facilitate the process of unlearning our miseducation. And we need to do that very specifically with younger people, younger folks, right?
I mean, prior to your time at Ebony, you had your page, The Beautiful Struggler, and you had Right, Fight, and Love. And this Fight and Love, again, made me think about Radio Raheem in the film and Love and Hate. And how do you reconcile it?
I think that those are two things that have defined my life and certainly my career as a writer and editor, fighting and loving. And I fight because I love, and, I've learned to love the fight, even though it can be very difficult and very painful. So with, this will be a super shameless plug, but if anyone has not seen the most recent cover of Ebony magazine, it's an image of the Cosby Show, or rather the Cosby Show cast. It's a cast photo from NBC under a broken glass, because that image has been shattered. And it's our family issue, and our November's always a family issue, but it's usually a happy, smiling celebrity couple and their adorable children. And instead, this time, we're taking on what has transpired in the wake of the allegations against Bill Cosby and how that has tarnished not only his own legacy, but possibly the legacy of this show and what that means to Black America. And it has certainly been a fight, and it's been a fight that we've even kind of had to have, not just internally with the C-suite to get something that provocative on the cover of Ebony magazine, but also with our readership, that how are we lovingly critical of our people? How do we have an important, painful conversation, and how do we confront these demonic, horrible acts that this person has been accused of without it feeling like we're attacking Black family or Black men? And it's something that we've done in love, and it certainly has been a real fight since we dropped that cover on Thursday or Friday.
And Noche, you're dealing with, in many ways, in your body, your mind, your soul, violence from police. Will you remain peaceful, or the end of the film talks about self-defense as the next kind of inevitable and intelligent next step. In his press conference in Cannes, I don't know what his position is now, but Spike said he put Malcolm after Dr. Martin Luther King in the film because he was in that frame of mind when he made the film, that he saw violence and self-defense as just intelligence. Where do you stand right now?
Well, I mean, look, if you talk about violence, the violence is already happening. This is what people are dealing with every day. You say, the way they come after me, but also, people all the time. The violence is already happening. And the question is, what are people going to do in the face of it? And just to be clear, I don't advocate, any kind of individual acts of violence or anything like that. But, I do want to make two separations, which is, one is if people defend themselves from violence, that's not violent, and that's actually an important, right that you have as a human being. And then, the last thing, and then the thing I'll say is right now there is a fight going on, and, it's people not, taking to arms and all that stuff, to be clear. But this Rise Up October effort is a mobilization of people from all around the country to carry out civil disobedience, to project the voices of the family members whose loved ones have been murdered by the police, and to march in the streets to send the message and to call on all of society to take a side on this police terror, question of stopping police terror. And when I talk about a revolution, I talk about this because I don't foresee, based on looking at the history of this country or anywhere in the world, I don't see a situation where people, rise up to deal with the fundamental system that they're up against, which causes all of this. And we're not just talking about what happens to black people. At least I'm not. When I look at the revolution, I'm talking about, look, our environment, our planet is being destroyed. Whether or not future generations can live and exist is being called into question. Women everywhere being knocked back to the Stone Ages, having the right to control their own body taken from them. The immigrants being rounded up. The wars on the world and torture and surveillance state. All of this is the cause of a system, and I don't foresee a situation where they're not going to bring violence to maintain it. And you saw it in Ferguson and in Baltimore. People rose up in rebellion to demand justice for someone who had just been murdered, and they faced down tanks and tear gas. And I think when we get to a situation where millions of people are determined to fight for a fundamental change, they're going to have to face the violent forces that are brought down on them. And in that situation, people are going to have to figure out, yes, what is intelligent and how do you actually go up against that? And again, you can't, people defending themselves and is a right to uphold. And I'm not advocating any acts of violence, right? Just to be clear. But I don't think the singing songs is going to make them wake up one day and say, oh, you were right. We have been doing wrong for hundreds and hundreds of years. We've never let up. We've committed war crime after war crime. We've slaughtered millions and millions of people in wars in all parts of Latin America, Asia, Africa, and on, and that they're going to wake up one day and sort of put down their weapons and say, oh, you're right. We've been wrong, and we're going to start doing right, or let you take over and start doing things far better. And again, in a future situation, a revolutionary people are going to have to figure out how to actually face that.
Patricia, I'd like to end with you, if I can. I'd like to, because in watching the film and reading your work, you've been writing about this and have been thinking about this for so long. In the end of the film, there's dedication to a lot of names, which now the list goes on and on and on. Michael Griffith, 23 years old, was hit, we talked about it, Howard Beach was hit by a car and killed, chased by the mob, 1986. Edmund Perry, 17-year-old Harlem resident, shot to death by plainclothes policeman, 1985. Yvonne Smallwood, 28-year-old Bronx woman, spent the last 6 days of her life in courts and in jail and died. Michael Stewart, 1983. He was killed by police in the same way we see Radio Raheem. Eleanor Bumpers, shot and killed 1984 by the police for owing $98 in back rent on her home. Arthur Miller, black community leader, choked to death by 20 cops in Crown Heights. Today, Jordan Davis, 2012, we talked about it, like Radio Raheem, killed by Michael Dunn for having his radio too loud. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland. As our elder who has written about this, has seen this for going on, what can you tell us? If you could snap your fingers, if there was one thing that you could just magically make happen, is there something that you would do, or?
I don't have. If I had a magic word, I would share it with you, but I don't. But it is my work is at the conceptual level. My sense of pushing back is really looking at the impressions that make, the difficulty, the real killing force of, for example, taking a phrase like Black Lives Matter and hearing it as hate speech. The mental state that feels like self-defense, but that when it inhabits George Zimmerman, he feels he has to kill Trayvon Martin. These are conceptual complexities that I don't have an easy answer for, but it does seem to me it is something about how we teach each other how we produce knowledge, and how we share that knowledge across community and among ourselves, and how it becomes so structurally powerful that none of us can escape, regardless of our race, ethnicity, or language. And so that's why, for me, it is about thought production. That's why I write, and that's why I enjoy the privilege of being in a university, and feel the obligation to work as an activist in this. But that is my sense of pushing back.
I think each of you in your own way are pushing back, and I thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ramin. And thanks to the audience. Most of you I can't see, but
Thank you for coming.